Okay, folks, it's time for the last word on Ivor's Swedish bullshit. It's time to understand the reality. Let's dig in.
Ultimate Sweden viral update, guys. Don't speak about Sweden until you've seen this first.
Here we have one of Ivor's signatures. He's scolding us not to talk to anyone or even really think about Sweden until he's prepared our minds to understand the reality. This is typical of Ivor's authoritarian bent.
Please share to help people understand. So we'll start with World Health Organization October 19 guidelines, culmination of decades of science around pandemic control.
Pandemic control. Of course, what he's leaving out is that this thing is not only dated 2019, which he's been very helpful to point out to us there, 2019, of course, being 1 year before the novel coronavirus hit. And so probably not that applicable, given that any information that could be in this thing is going to be informed by zero understanding of COVID. But that's not all. If you look at this closely, you'll see it's non-pharmaceutical public health measures for mitigating the risk and impact of epidemic and pandemic influenza. Guess what? Influenza is not COVID, and COVID is not influenza, no matter how much Ivor tries to present it as such and convince us that COVID is just nothing more than a little bit of a bad flu. This is a common rhetorical foil of Ivor's, and it's really very important for his listeners to understand that COVID and the flu, from a disease management perspective, are interchangeable. And that therefore, anything that we used to do or any understanding that we have of influenza is instantaneously transferable to what we should do with COVID. And therefore, if we are doing things with COVID in terms of NPIs, non-pharmaceutical interventions, they're in any way different from what we might do for an influenza pandemic, then we're being inconsistent or hypocritical. This is, of course, utter nonsense.
Quarantine of exposed individuals, not recommended, not recommended, not recommended.
Not recommended. Why is it not recommended? Well, because as they say here on this very slide, basically a bunch of people infected with the flu, ordinary seasonal flu, is not that much of a big deal, given seasonal flu's very, very low infection fatality rate, particularly when compared to COVID.
Right? Once a virus has substantially come into a population, it doesn't add enough value. They didn't even discuss lockdowns of societies because that would have appeared too absurd.
Yes, it would have appeared too absurd to lock down a society for a flu. That's pretty much exactly what they're saying here on this slide. But Ivor wants us to believe that it's just as applicable to COVID, which it is not.
Late last year. So we now have at this link, you can get 22 papers which illustrate that lockdowns don't correlate even with mortality per million outcomes across all the countries.
This is, of course, abject bullshit. And the only way you can believe this is if you somehow reject the 100-year-old theory of germ transmission, which says basically that one person who's sick with something can infect someone else. For you to not believe that lockdowns or social distancing or any kind of mitigation, such as hand washing or mask wearing, affects the transmission of a disease from one individual to another one, you have to absolutely outright reject the germ theory of disease transmission. Ivor won't say that because he doesn't believe that people think he's that crazy or that uninformed. So instead what he's going to do is he's going to throw up a whole bunch of stuff he found on the internet from various cranks that he's assembled on his Dropbox that he thinks prove the issue. And I'll guarantee if you read 99% of them, that's exactly what they don't say. He has a very good habit of reading into anything he comes across what he wants to read into it and ignoring what it actually says.
So 22, and we don't have a single credible one suggesting that they do. Also here you can download some of the papers on harms and go to this website to see 80 plus. Lockdown cost benefit.
That's an interesting website, collateralglobal.org. This is something put up by the same geniuses that gave us the Great Barrington Declaration. It's mostly a hodgepodge of libertarian economists out of places like Stanford Hoover Institute who are so upset that there could be any threat to their libertarian worldview that says that no collective action on any aspect of anything could possibly be beneficial, that they're going to throw up all kinds of crap to make us believe that. And this is exactly the kind of thing that people like Ivor soak up like a sponge.
Is shockingly negative.
Shockingly.
Here's one paper, lockdown stringency versus deaths per million, 50 countries, no real relationship.
I've never seen that, and I think it's just bullshit.
And here's the Lancet. Rapid border closures, lockdowns, widespread testing, not associated with COVID mortality per million people.
That's actually not what that paper says.
Latest one out, metabolic health, etc., correlates with mortality per million. But this paper also saw, I think 190 countries analysed, lockdown, etc., did not appear to be linked with death rate.
Frontiers in Public Health has a long and storied history of, among other things, being anti-vaxxers and promoting papers that push an anti-vaccination view for reasons that I frankly think just have to do with selling more stuff.
So now we get on to Sweden. Here's Sweden and Ireland. If you correct for demographics in Sweden, aged profiles, etc., they performed around the same.
Actually, no, they didn't. If you look at the two curves, you will see that the Ireland curve is significantly narrower than the Swedish curve. In particular, Ireland's rise in death rates began about 2 weeks after Sweden's rise in death rates, and it ended almost 2 months before Sweden's did. So Ireland's fairly stringent and fairly strong effects at a quote-unquote lockdown have had a direct and measurable effect on the death rate, which is clear to see in this graph that he's providing. Sweden's death rate, on the other hand, is spread out over months and months. Ireland's rise is relatively short and sharp. Sweden's just went on and on and on and on. And that's one of the reasons why Sweden has 10 times the deaths that is per capita, that its next door neighbor, Norway, with whom it shares the longest border in all of Europe, has.
Always get the same curve in Europe,
It's not the same curve.
regardless. Sweden, filmed by CNN back in May 6th, in their epidemic, old ladies getting haircut, no masks, kids up to 16 in the schools, 1 meter distance, stay at home if you're sick, work from home if you can, following the classic WHO guidelines.
The classic WHO guidelines for influenza. Once again, COVID is not influenza. Now, he likes to throw up these CNN pictures. I don't know what he thinks they prove, because frankly, you can go into any town in any city in the entire United States and pull up very similar pictures. So he somehow wants us to believe that everyone else is living their lives behind doors welded shut, whereas that's not actually the lived reality that any of us have. Most of us are living lives that look pretty much identical to these pictures.
What about for the last few months? How have they been? Well, here's photos sent to me from my people in Sweden. Here's some more photos.
Wouldn't we all like to have our people in Sweden? Again, these are street scenes. I've got friends in New York. They can send me pretty much identical looking stuff from New York. I don't know what this proves.
Masks, even in public transport. Here's a few years for Sweden for mortality per week, right? And you can see November, December, January is often pretty stiff. You know, these were some tough years. What about 2020 compared to those? Right.
Oh, I'm going to let this go on.
Here's another graph which corrects for population age profile. You can see 19 was soft, 20 not remarkable.
This is part of the whole excess mortality grift that the COVID truthers are playing on. They want us to believe somehow that Sweden's additional deaths over previous years for 2020 are unremarkable. And in some cases, they'll even go so far as to say that Sweden's having fewer deaths this year than it had in previous years. This is a kind of a weird argument on a number of different levels, because it says basically, if you believe one part of it, it says that, well, if you have a really good year in which people don't die from traffic accidents and cancer and falls and whatever as much as they did on a normal year, then it's okay for a whole bunch of them to die from a pandemic, because it all evens out. And after all, death is just a zero-sum game. So as long as, we keep deaths at a constant rate, it doesn't matter what people are dying from, which most people not only think is ridiculous, but they probably find pretty offensive. But what the real reality is that excess deaths, first of all, are extremely problematic in the real-time monitoring of a pandemic. The collection of excess death data is a huge lagging indicator, which means it takes the government and the bureaucrats a long time to collect this data. So if I'm looking in the fall at what I want to know are the excess deaths for the fall, well, frankly, I'm not going to actually know that with any kind of precision until a year from now. But these guys like to harp on it because it makes their numbers look better. The reality is Sweden, like just everywhere else, in the United States, the CDC is currently reporting between 270,000 and 360,000 excess deaths over what is normal, of which they attribute at least 270 of those to COVID deaths. Now, some people want to pretend that the gap between 270 and 360 is due to so-called lockdown deaths, which again is ridiculous. It's probably a significant undercounting of COVID deaths because, particularly in the United States, undercounting is politically advantageous. And in Sweden, we see the same pattern. Sweden has now over 6,000 COVID deaths. And those numbers are beginning to show up really pretty precisely in Sweden's excess mortality. But what people like Ivor do is they take that data and they construct it and they torture it, they waterboard it, so that they can produce graphs that look like this one, where we're lulled into a sense of complacency because we think, oh, actually nothing's going on, which of course is ridiculous.
Here's a longer historical perspective. You can see Spanish flu, which was a once-in-a-century oddity, and the second wave here is generally accepted to be a separate virus or pathogen, so it's a misleading example. We look at the last few decades, we have spikes for influenzas, tough ones. What about this year? There's a spike also.
Okay, I'm going to pause this one. This graph has been floating around, and I frankly don't understand it whatsoever. First of all, it ignores the fact that for the past 100 years or so, overall mortality in Sweden, as in other places, has been falling pretty precipitously. So when you look at earlier periods of excess mortality, you're going to see less. But that's just because that's what the historic trend has been. Now, in the United States, as in Sweden, COVID-19 is the #1 cause of death. COVID-19 in the United States has so far this year, in just 9 months, killed more people than the 1958 influenza pandemic, the 1968 influenza pandemic, the swine flu pandemic put together. Right now, COVID-19 is the largest disease outbreak in terms of deaths per 100,000 in the United States since the Spanish flu. And the same is true in Sweden.
As you can see, even with no lockdown, nothing particularly remarkable.
It's also a myth that Sweden, quote, did not have a lockdown. While Sweden, on a public face, liked to tout the fact that they were letting people be responsible and they weren't putting any kind of heavy-handed government interventions in place, what we actually see from things like Google's mobility data is that Sweden exhibited a drop in mobility very similar to its European counterparts and almost identical, in fact, to most American cities in the Midwest. So this notion that Sweden didn't do anything in response to the emergence of the pandemic in March of 2020 is also frankly false.
Here's Sweden's latest data as of November 26th from the government website, which tries to correct for lag. The cases have curled over. Here's ICU leveling off, right? It's a winter resurgence, which we spoke of many.
Winter resurgence. Here's Ivors going back to the seasonal influenza characteristic of COVID theme that he has. Again, as I explained in another video, there is absolutely no data whatsoever supporting the notion that COVID is a seasonal disease in the same manner that influenza is. COVID in the United States surged in spring. It surged again in the middle of summer, and it's surging again in fall. None of those seasons sees any influenza incidents in the United States. So this notion that we are somehow, this rise in deaths that we see in Sweden, that he's got on his chart, is somehow just a seasonal factor, is complete nonsense. What's going on here is that it's just rising again as various distancing and other NPI efforts are being relaxed. We saw that throughout Europe. We see it in the United States. Influenza, in fact, influenza incidence in the United States and Sweden isn't scheduled, if you will, to begin rising again until about the beginning of December. So if it's seasonal, it's getting a jump on influenza by at least a couple months. And of course, he's not going to explain that or even touch it.
Months ago, epidemic, winter resurgence, and in the 6 months in between here,
it's not winter yet.
Lots of frail elderly who 6 months makes a huge difference in their frailty. And you'll have people move to stage 4 cancer, sadly, and, immunocompromised. So the winter resurgence of the coronavirus will have an effect.
Again, it's not winter.
The Sweden deaths appear to be curling over.
They're actually not curling over. Sweden's public health agency reports deaths on what's called a day of death basis, which means that they don't actually record a death until the day that the death occurred comes in. So what happens is that normally they will be getting death reports in on a constant basis. So let's say it's Friday, they will get in a stack of death reports. Some of those death reports will refer to deaths that happened up to a couple weeks earlier. And they will then retroactively go back and add those deaths to the days on which they actually happened. Now that sounds fairly reasonable, and in the long term it is. But in the short term, it doesn't allow you to have any real understanding of just how fast deaths are increasing or decreasing. And even more importantly, what it does is it makes it appear as if your deaths are constantly declining. Now, Ivor knows this, but he's not going to own up to it for fairly obvious reasons. So let's say on Friday, they get 96 death reports. Well, on Friday, they're not going to report that there were 96 deaths. They're only going to report on Friday the number of deaths that they get on Friday that actually happened on Friday. That's not very likely to happen at all, which means that on Friday, they typically are going to report 0 deaths because none of the deaths that come in on Friday actually happened on Friday because of processing delays, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So what that does is it produces exactly what you see on this chart here, which is where it always looks like deaths are declining, which is not the actual picture. And again, Ivor knows this, but he's going to gloss over it.
Some lag here, but again, you can see the impact versus the actual first wave of an epidemic, which is the real epidemic.
I don't know what he means by that, the real epidemic. The fact is that in Sweden, deaths right now are running at approximately half the maximum level they saw back in spring. In all of Europe, in fact, deaths are now running on a per capita deaths per day basis higher than they ever were in spring. So this notion that the first one is the real one And second ones, no matter how bad they are not real, is just a pure fiction.
Here's Sweden all-cause mortality right up.
All-cause mortality. Again, this is a statistical technique that the COVID truthers use to hide the actual things that are going on. Once again, COVID-19 at 6,000 plus deaths in Sweden so far is the #1 cause of death for 2020 in Sweden, by far.
The date, credit Joel Smalley in the UK, who's doing incredible analysis. Green line is all-cause mortality. There's the upper and lower expected from the last 5 years. As you can see, they're trailing under, like Ireland. And there may be some lag, but
there may be some lag. There is lag, and it's substantial.
Going to make any great waves this winter.
Again, deaths in Europe are currently running at a higher level per day than they were back in spring. So I don't know what he's talking about it not being any great waves this winter. And by the way, winter hasn't started yet.
You can also see that there were other years previously, mainly January and December, where you can be up really high, right? And here's the corona spike. Okay?
And here's the corona spike, about 2 months after the influenza spike. So again, not seasonal.
Here's Sweden versus UK. You can see again Sweden worldometer curling over.
Curling over for the reasons I gave before. There is a lag in the reports of deaths. It will always appear, if you are using the official Swedish health data, that deaths are curling over. That's just the way they collect the statistic.
UK flattened off. These are following seasonal resurgence of a seasonal.
How can it be a seasonal resurgence if it's flattening off? Again, the influenza season hasn't even begun yet. Now, he points out that the UK is flattening off. He's going to try and tell us that that's because the seasonal peak has already come and passed in the fall, not in the winter. What's actually happening in the UK and in France and in Belgium and in all of Europe, with the exception of Sweden, is that it's falling off because they are going back into lockdown. The simplest explanation for why these curves bend over is, again, the germ theory of transmission, something that Ivor will never acknowledge. It's always something else.
Virus. So there will be an impact in the winter following the real epidemic, and it will vary depending on metabolic health and other factors.
Metabolic health. This is a dog whistle to the keto crowd. Metabolic health is basically a way of virtue signaling that there is a race of people, if you will, that are so well endowed genetically, demographically in terms of age, and as well as how they live their lives, that they are, as Ivor would put it, de facto immune to this disease. And in contrast to what Ivor calls the susceptibles. The susceptibles to him are basically all of those who are genetically inferior and incapable of fending off the disease, that those of the people within his lifestyle circle, if you will, are capable. So anytime you hear him say metabolic health, again, that's dog whistle for people who buy my diet book and eat the things I tell them to eat.
Norway and Finland are lower. I'll explain Norway and Finland and
Can't wait.
Nordic difference. So you can see Sweden here in the prior couple of years had a very under mortality, under expected. See that huge trough? That dictates to a large extent the height of your impact from a new...
This is the famous dry tinder theory, that whenever you have a year or a period where mortality falls underneath what is expected, what happens is you're essentially building up a large stock of basically old people who didn't die when they were supposed to die. And so as soon as any kind of circumstance comes along, like COVID, that kind of pushes them along towards the Grim Reaper, you're going to have a rise. So under the dry tinder theory, when deaths are lower than what you expect, you build up a large stock of essentially feeble and metabolically unhealthy people who should have died, but they didn't. So now they're getting their comeuppance. Now, the problem with this whole thing is, well, there's a lot of problems, and we're going to see something that he's going to step into in just a second here. But the biggest problem is that there's always a dip every single year. And so you can't use this bogus theory to explain why the dip this year is why we see COVID so high in Sweden this year as well.
Virus that hits seasonally and pretty hard. UK is similar, big trough, big impact. But you can see Finland and Norway are completely different.
Look at Finland and Norway. Especially look at Norway.
Right. So Sweden actually did a great job and had soft flu seasons, and it came back to bite them, sadly.
Sadly.
Here's a paper on this.
This is something out of the American Economic Enterprise, basically the Great Barrington folks. And what's really interesting here is that they disprove their own theory. What they've got here is a graph of Sweden. The big solid yellow line for Sweden is what they refer to as the stock, as if people were cattle, of people who didn't die when they were supposed to. And the yellow bar with the striations is those who died from COVID. And so what they want you to believe is that the number of people who didn't die when they were supposed to then did die because of COVID, and that's why Sweden has such a high death rate. But when they're going to gloss over, and you're going to hear Ivar do exactly this in just a second here, is Norway, way over here on the right. Norway also had a very large stock, and in fact, I think I got it backwards. It doesn't really matter too much. The striation is the stock, and the green part is the deaths. So Norway basically had, according to them, half as many people who should have died but didn't, but it's actually got the lowest level of COVID deaths of any of these four. And they're not going to address that at all. And the reason why they won't address it is because it completely blows away this stupid theory.
And it shows Sweden had a big stock per million of very frail elderly, and commensurately it got hit pretty hard. Denmark and Finland, completely different stock of frail elderly, and got hit less. And Norway's intermediate.
Intermediate.
Paper, 16 factors for Sweden's higher death rate among the Nordics. Number one is what I just described, the build-up of frail elderly. And there's another 14, and then lockdown's number 16. And
this particular paper, again, written by a bunch of libertarian economists, and it's just completely, not anyone who with any kind of infectious disease specialty, it's just economists trying to prove that their particular ideology is correct, and using COVID as the vehicle for doing that. The great thing about this thing is that it starts off with the 16 possible factors. It's just complete conjecture, that they're trying to throw at the wall to see if it sticks.
It shows, as I showed you, very little impact. And here's another view, Sweden here in the black, in the 1920 season, respiratory season, versus the Nordics, right? Age standardized mortality rates, the metric that matters. Okay, don't see anything there either.
Actually, you do.
Versus Japan and South Korea, a lot of interest in how they're so low, in Singapore. Now, I ask any of you out there who still have a functioning brain, do you really think that Japan and the areas in the East got this kind of performance through intermittent lockdowns and some mask wearing, right?
No, they got this kind of performance because they limited infections. Again, you can't get sick unless you're infected, and you don't die from the disease unless you're sick from it in the first place. What Japan and the rest of the Asian countries, particularly the so-called SARS countries that had experience with SARS-1 back in the mid-2000s, was that they learned very quickly that it was very necessary to maintain high vigilance for the disease and to enact policies that limited the spread of the infection. The reason for Japan's low death rates, as well as those of Singapore, Vietnam, etc., is not because of any metabolic difference. It's not because of anything other than the fact that they were very effective at minimizing infection. It's as simple as that. They were essentially the opposite of Sweden. Sweden encouraged infection and then was surprised that it had a very high death rate.
Does that make any scientific sense? No, it doesn't. So I'll show you.
Ivor uses the term scientific and science the way the rest of us would use a gun.
Couple of reasons why there are big differences. Just as an example, Italian women who are elderly, lower than 5 nanogram vitamin D per mil is catastrophic metabolic dysfunction.
Ivor early on started selling kind of I don't even know what to call it, but basically a cure for COVID in the form of vitamin D. And it's refreshing to see that he's not giving up on that. There's no data whatsoever, no research that supports the notion that vitamin D is in any way significantly protective of anyone against COVID, much less a cure. What we do know is that if you suffer from very low vitamin D situation, that your immune system is not operating the best it can. But to try and link low vitamin D levels the way he's doing right now to the differences in the performance, as opposed to linking the much more sensical and obvious, which is namely the spread of the infection within the communities, is a real stretch.
Right? They got nearly a quarter of them in one study were below 5, and 3/4 of them below 12, which is disaster zone. Japan, a couple of studies in this paper, strikingly low instance of vitamin D deficiency versus Europe, and it does. And in one study of active elderly, being below 30, there were only 5% of them. So 95% were above 30, which is metabolically healthy, right, with this marker, versus 3/4 of them below 12, which is disaster zone. So this is just one indication of metabolic health in the elderly that's massively different, right?
Of course, he's not going to do any kind of correlation between vitamin D levels of people in, say, Sweden and why they have such a high death rate. He's going to zoom in on Italy and Japan, which are outliers.
East and Vietnam and other places too. The middle-aged may be getting fat and diabetic, right, with their sugar, refined grains and seed oils, but the elderly are different, right? They're old school. Also, Japan, and this is crucial, a recent study no one's talking about, here's the tracking of PCR positive during their surge, okay? But in the circles, this is a few hundred people where they tested them for antibodies every couple of weeks to SARS-CoV-2. Look what happened. Up to 50% of the group almost generated antibodies to SARS-CoV-2. So in Japan, with no lockdown really, right, and intermittent use of masks, not 100%, okay, they were getting a whole massive ton of infection because they did a proper study. They just were.
This is actually not true, like most of the things he said. The study that he's talking about was a fairly opaque study where it's not even really clear what the population was that they selected for. In most of the serology studies done in Japan, they found extremely low seroprevalence levels. So again, he's done one of his favorite tricks, which is to essentially cherry pick.
Getting the death and ICU impacts, they were vastly lower. And that's because of population health and T-cell pre-existing immunity. You can still get infected and make antibodies, but if you have prior immunity to prior coronaviruses, which may be much more prevalent over in those regions, right, you will get a much less severe reaction.
Here we go with one of Igor's next favorite things, which is the so-called T-cell immunity. This is based initially on a paper that was published in Cell over the middle of summer. In that paper, they noted that there was what they called reactivity, meaning that certain memory T cells within the human body seem to react in the presence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus, as even though the individuals themselves had not previously been exposed to the virus. And so there was some speculation as to what was going on, and the speculation was that prior immunity, or prior exposure rather, to human coronaviruses could provoke this reactivity. Now, I want to say a couple things. First of all, this is entirely expected. If you understand how the immune system works, then when you have a virus present itself that has enough similarity in terms of protein sequences with another virus, the immune system is going to react. That's how it works. So people are expressing surprise that there's reactivity when in actuality it's entirely expected. The second thing, and this was explicitly stated in the Cell paper, is we do not know what that reactivity means. In particular, we do not know if it is helpful, i.e. does it stimulate an immune response that actually lessens the effect of the virus? Is it neutral, meaning that the reactivity doesn't really go anywhere and does nothing? Or is it actually pathogenic? And that was the term that was used in the Cell paper. Pathogenic basically is medicine's way of saying, is it bad? And by bad, it generally means, does it produce an immune overreaction? And immune overreactions are typically, well, first of all, they are very common. And they are associated with, among other things, what we refer to as cytokine storms, where the immune system produces enough T cells that they begin destroying too many of the body's own cells. Essentially, the disease turns the immune system against the body, and the immune system is what ends up killing the individual. And again, the Cell paper was very explicit about this. They said, we know it's reacting. We don't know if it's helpful or harmful. And that conjecture is still frankly out there. There's a lot of debate about where it is. There are people who feel very strongly that there's probably a beneficial effect. There are other people who are not so sure, but I think the real point to be made is that it is not settled. And even more importantly, reactivity is not immunity. So what Ivor wants us to believe, because it's very important for him and what he may get into later in terms of so-called herd immunity, that people are already largely immune to this disease. Ergo, we don't need to do anything about it. And the T-cell reactivity study was a really convenient way for him to assert that, as he has said repeatedly, 80% of us are, quote unquote, de facto immune. Now, that is something that is simply not borne out by the data. Again, we have lots of incidences of fairly heterogeneous populations. We have people in nursing homes, we have prison populations, we have institutional populations such as colleges and universities, we have cruise ships, we have warships, we have factories, all of which are places where levels of infection have reached 80 to 100% of the entire population. Now, that couldn't happen if just kind of on a random basis, 80% of us were already immune. So again, this is a situation where he's digging deep into kind of theoretical and empirical data, and in a gross violation of Occam's razor, is concluding the most complex conclusions to these things, when the simplest conclusion, namely that the vast majority of us are susceptible, and that there is probably not at least substantial, quote unquote, beneficial or, I hate to use the term, immunity to this. But instead he's going to harp on it over and over and over again. And in fact, this paper that he's pulled up here says exactly that. It says we don't know.
So, when we go back, Japan being this low along with other similar regions.
Again, it's that low because the infection prevalence is very low, not because of any other factors.
That's not lockdown and masks, guys. And anyone who thinks it is deluding themselves.
He's talking about you.
So that's a quick one on Sweden. Hopefully it sets the record straight. Again, all of this data and science is published, government source data, World in Data, and I'm quoting directly from WHO from their own published documents.
Quoting directly is not the same thing as quoting accurately. Again, he's cherry-picking sources. He's using data and research that has to do with a totally different disease, namely influenza, and saying, well, it's just as applicable to COVID. And then he's telling you that it has to be accurate because it's quote unquote science. And in fact, what it all is bullshit.